Okay, so here we are. It is 1947. It has been 6 years since Abbott and Costello first burst onto the scene with One Night in the Tropics, and then made a huge splash with their first solo film, Buck Private. And in that time, America's been to war. It has won the war, and it is now trying to fade out of the war. The 40s are on the way out, their last couple years before we enter into the 50s. And Abbott and Costello have had a roller coaster of a career up to this point. They've released 19 movies or 18 movies in total, if you include One Night in the Tropics. They've been the biggest box office smash. They've suffered personal tragedies. They've come back. Their movies were the highest grossing things in the world, and then were kind of leveling out to being somewhat profitable. They've gone through huge format and formula changes, from the routine-driven piece to the more story-driven piece, to varying results. Unfortunately, as much as I love The Time of Their Lives, and as much as I find Little Giant to be a decent film, but not great, audiences were just not responding to the new way the Abbott and Costello films were being presented. Even though I believe, again, Time of Their Lives would go on to be a bona fide classic, at the time, like many classics, it was, just kind of ho-hum at the box office, and the studios were going through a lot of changes as well. Times were changing. It was almost a decade on, and we know no trend really stays in one place for that long, especially in popular culture, and the studio was struggling to kind of figure out what to do with Abbott and Costello at that stage. It's not that they weren't still bringing in the money. They were, but it was not as much money as they used to. And, let's be honest. Let's be really honest. By this time, the audiences were getting a little tired of it. It's not that they didn't like the Abbott and Costello movies, but it's like, okay, I'm going to be honest here, and I'm going to throw some stones at myself that I'm always throwing at other people. It's kind of like I'm always criticizing cast members from Saturday Night Live, like Adam Sandler and Will Ferrell and Mike Myers. They do the same thing in every one of their movies, and when it first comes out, everyone's like, oh, Adam Sandler, you're the funniest thing that ever existed. Oh, he's so funny when he does that. And then it goes on. He's doing the same bit. The people who loved him in college are now older, and they're not finding the shtick as good anymore, and they usually try to change course and try to do something different, which they either respond to or don't. It's the same thing here. So the studio didn't want to get rid of Abbott and Costello. I don't think they could. Also, I think they still were under contract, but the question was, where do we go? This new direction isn't working, so what can we do with them? And it was their new director's idea, I believe, who said, well, they started out with Buck Privates, and what we need to do is we need to remind the audience of why they fell in love with Abbott and Costello in the first place. So what if, we started out with them right before the war began. Well, the war is over now, so what if we do Buck Privates Come Home? And that's what happened. So for the first and only time in their careers, Abbott and Costello were now going to do a sequel. So that's an interesting prospect, because you can almost say that almost every Abbott and Costello movie is a sequel of the one before. They're playing essentially the same characters. But one movie ends, and then they go to the next one, and you're kind of set back to zero. So now bringing back two of their characters who have had life-changing situations happen to them, being drafted, going to war, and, all that. Now the question is, what are you going to do with them when they come home, and how are the characters going to grow from where we last saw them? Because they have to grow. If you're telling a second story, the situation has to change. It just has to. Even if it's just minor changes, it's got to change, or else there's no point in telling this new story. So what changes for Herbie and Slicker, i.e. Lou and Bud, when it's time for the buck privates to come home from war. Well, let me tell you. So the story this time is the war is over. Herbie and Slicker are coming home, along with their Sergeant Collins, once again played by the wonderful Nate Pendleton. Nate Pendleton. So wonderful that he reprised his role. They're coming home. However, they've brought someone with them. Apparently, while they were over in Europe, they were kind of adopted by a little French girl named Evie, who was an orphan, and she became kind of their company mascot. And now with the war over and the GIs leaving, they were facing the prospect of leaving this little girl in war-torn France without parents and having to send her to an orphanage. So Herbie, Lou, decides to smuggle her back to America and try to adopt her. And that kind of becomes the crux of the entire thing. She's in the country illegally, so people are after them. So Sergeant Collins, now back on the police force, is chasing after them, trying to catch Evie to send her back. And the boys are trying to keep her safe and try to figure out ways that they can adopt her. There's a lot here. And one of the things I say this movie has a ton of heart. Which the Abbott and Costello movies have always had, in my opinion. I think they're always very heartfelt. And this one definitely is very heartfelt. They learned a lesson. One of the many lessons you can learn is that for everything you might be able to say about him, Lou Costello had a certain rapport with children. I've mentioned it before that I've often think of him and John Candy in that same way, that there's something very special when you watch either one of those actors do scenes with kids. They just have a connection with them that is very natural and very unique. And Lou has a very natural connection with Beverly Simmons, who plays Evie, who does an amazing job. She is really good in this movie. I was kind of shocked to see that when I looked up her IMDb page, she only had a couple films to her credit, which I find kind of bizarre. She was a very, very good actor in this, and that's not easy to play opposite Lou Costello, as a lot of people would attest. Not that he was difficult, but just, he has a very unique energy, and you have to control him. And I think giving him this kid as an emotional center of the film really works. And it was a great, again, as I mentioned before, if you're going to do a sequel, the thing you have to always do is your characters have to change. They have to evolve. And I think giving Herbie and Slicker, these two kind of bottom-of-the-barrel, small-time hustlers, not really caring about anyone outside of their own immediate survival, giving these two characters someone to care about, giving them someone that now they are trying to make themselves better for, gives them that motivation for change and gives them that motivation to grow as characters. Everything that we saw them do, let's forget about all the rest of the Abbott and Costello filmography and just focus on these two films like these are the only two. An original film and its sequel. In the original, Herbie and Slicker had no real concern for anything outside of their own immediate self. Survival, finding food, trying to survive in the army. And now you give them someone to care about, and now the film becomes about them trying to become better people. And that's what this film is. Everything that's done in this movie, it is these two hustlers basically trying to become respectable citizens so that they can become parents to this little girl. It's a small change. It's enough to motivate a plot, and it's not like a huge thing. We're not seeing these two become different characters or the same characters, but changing their motivation gives them character growth. And it makes it a different film than what we've seen before with the franchise. What you also see is a very different take as it relates to their relationship with Sergeant Collins. Because in the first one, he was a foil. He was an obstacle. He was a bully. Not a mean one, but he was kind of the authority figure that they were always trying to get around, especially Lou. But they never really gave him the short end of the stick too much. He always kind of got one up on them because they were trying to portray the Army in a positive light. So Sergeant Collins kind of always came out on top in his interactions with Herbie. Now in this one, now that they're all out of the Army, the war is over, and we can kind of have fun. This one, Collins really becomes the butt of their jokes and really becomes the guy who gets it because of them, more so than anybody else. And again, it's a fun change to the dynamic and a fun change to their relationship. And I said it way back in the first or the second one of these when I was reviewing Buck Privates, that I think Nat Pendleton, I keep getting his name wrong, sorry, was one of the best comic foils for Bud and Lou ever. I think he was one of their best co-stars, and bringing him back and giving them this new dynamic in the relationship really worked, and he really sold it. It was great to see him back. We never do find out what happened to the other folks from Buck Privates, which I think is okay. There's a minor curiosity, but, you know, we've evolved past that point where the B story is not the dominant story. We don't care. We've learned the lessons that everything needs to benefit Abbott and Costello's story. So we do have the boy-girl in this one. We have a lady officer in the Army, Sylvia, who's played by Joan Fulton, and her boyfriend, who Herbie and Slicker team up with to try to get a job and, you know, basically help them adopt Evie. So there is a boy-girl story in there, but it's all tied into Abbott and Costello's story. Another reason I think this is a good one is that I think it serves as kind of an interesting time capsule. I mentioned this way back when I was reviewing the Maisie films. If you watch the Maisie series, it's a time capsule for, you know, America at that time. We're going through the Great Depression, and then we're into the war years, and then we're into the post-war years, and you can kind of see Maisie travel through that timeline with the audience. And it's the same thing here. We see a lot of war movies. There are, especially at that time, there were so many movies. Some might call them propaganda films, but there were a lot of movies about World War II, and they were still making a lot of movies about World War II at this time. But there was not a lot being done to talk about what happened after the war was won. What was the after effects of all this? And not in a larger, you know, global situation, but a personal one. What happens when these soldiers, the greatest generation, what happens when they come home? There was a movie released the year right before this one, a great film called The Best Years of Our Lives, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture that year, which dealt with those issues of, you know, a sailor coming home with no arms, a guy coming home with post-traumatic stress, a guy who was a captain and in charge of an airplane, now coming home and being just kind of a regular slob again and trying to get back some of that respect and dignity he had in the Army. So that movie really dealt with the realities of folks coming home from war. And this film, even though this is clearly a comedy, deals with a lot of those same issues. It deals with the concept of, you know, people coming back changed, coming back different people than who they were, and trying to fit back into the lives that they had and finding that those lives no longer fit them. It deals with things like, you know, housing shortages, all these people coming back all at once and needing a place to live and there being no place for them to go. It deals with the, you know, the realities of, you know, trying to get a GI loan and trying to start up a family. It's also interesting that this film kind of highlights how far we've come socially in a lot of instances. Because, of course, back then it was unheard of that an unmarried man would be able to adopt a child. In fact, that's one of the roadblocks they run into, is that Herbie and Slicker can't adopt Evie legally because neither one of them are married. And, you know, giving a child to a single man, let alone two single men, you know, I'm not saying, but, you know, I'm sure people could draw parallels if they really want to. You know, that was just unheard of. So it's very interesting. You don't see a lot of that in movies. You see a lot of dated concepts when it comes to women and minorities and things like that in a lot of these old movies, but very rarely do you see kind of an outdated concept in terms of what a man is not able to do in society. And again, there's not much white men weren't allowed to do in society, but there were some things that they couldn't do, and it's interesting to kind of see that. Yeah, this film is really warm and very, very heartfelt, and it's wonderful to see that. Again, I need to talk about this. And talking about the cast, so I've already talked about Beverly Simmons, who played Evie. Wonderful little actor, and she's cute as a button. Does a great plays opposite Lou very, very well. I have to give a shout out to an actor I have not mentioned yet, but I feel like I need to mention him because this is now the fourth consecutive Abbott and Costello film that he has appeared in. That is the actor Donald McBride, who's a character actor with a lot of credits to his name. But he appears in so many of these, going all the way back to when we were looking at Abbott and Costello in Hollywood. He played the head of the movie studio in that one. He played a train conductor in Little Giant. He was one of the police officers who came to arrest Bud in The Time of Their Lives. And here he plays Sergeant Collins's superior officer on the police force. He's just this great, funny character actor with this big barking voice. So I just wanted to bring attention to Donald McBride, a brilliant character actor, and like I say, there's 4 Abbott and Costello films in a row. That's pretty impressive. So yeah, just want to bring credit to him. The film tries to blend the two worlds of Abbott and Costello together. The boy-girl story, the long drawn-out chase in the middle, with some of the lessons that they've learned since then, with the more story-driven. Not just having it be routine, and having the humor come out of the situation. I'm trying to remember. I don't think Abbott and Costello do any of their classic routines in this one. It's all situation. There's a great bit where they're trying to set up a dinner on the ship that they're coming home in. They only put one sawhorse under the table, so it keeps going back and forth like a teeter-totter as they're putting food on it. There's a very funny bit when they're going to get the when they're trying to go get the loan, and they're trying to get a loan so they can get into the race car business, and they bring a model of the car with them to show to the guy, and it goes off, and Lou's holding it, and they think it's a machine gun. They think he's robbing the place. Very funny stuff. Like I was saying about the men not being able to adopt. There's one line in this that doesn't work anymore, but worked then. But it is still a very funny line, and for no other reason than the delivery. And that is when Bud and Lou find out they can't adopt Evie because they're not married. They have this little scene in the park, and Bud says, "Well, you hear what that guy says, we have to get married." And Lou goes, "Oh, Slicker, you wouldn't marry me, would you?" He says, "Of course not. You ever heard of anybody marrying a man?" "Yes, sir." "Who?" "My mother." I'm not doing it justice. It was a very funny exchange, and just the way Lou says it, just very, "My mother," there you go. Again, not doing it justice. Again, this is the only sequel that Abbott and Costello ever did. And I think it's a really good one. It's a wonderful piece of their filmography, and it was wonderful to see what happens to some of their characters after the movie, what other adventures they might get into. And very heartwarming, very lovely, and a time capsule for a time when the war was over and we were trying to figure out what to do from here. Kind of like we are trying to do now. We haven't fought a war, but we've been in quarantine for over a year, and we're now trying to figure out where do we go from here? How do we start life back up again? And I'm sure that can draw a parallel to what was going on there, so we can relate. So this film does a lot better. Abbott and Costello kind of have a little bit of a resurgence. So they decide they're going to try to stick with the formulas that are working. Separating Bud and Lou out isn't working. They need movies where they are together and they are interacting with each other and doing some of their routines. But they also say, hey, you know, this whole thing about, you know, letting the comedy come from the situation instead of just kind of dropping them into a scenario and letting them do routines, that seems to be working. So let's keep that up. And for the next film that they do, they're going to try to correct what I think was one of their big blots on their record in their early days. And if you remember back to my review of Ride 'em Cowboy and saying this one just didn't work, and what I felt would work with that film is if they had actually done a Western as opposed to just a pseudo modern day Western. Why not just have them do a real Western? Well, next up, Abbott and Costello will do a Western. So when we return next time, Abbott and Costello will match wits with Marjorie Main as the wistful widow of Wagon Gap. So hope to see you there. Thanks for joining us. And as always, drive safe, and I will see you at the movies.